We are coming to you from the Omni Seaport Hotel in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm Sarah Golden, I'm VP of Energy at GreenBiz.
Hi, I'm Dylan Siegler, and I lead corporate sustainability at GreenBiz.
So, today we are going to be, we are already at this event that's being, there's 900 attendees that are here, there's 50 breakout sessions that have already begun this morning.
And thousands more of you joining us on the live stream, so welcome to you joining us from home or your office or the street or a coffee shop or wherever it is you're coming to us from. At Sidebar, you'll hear some exclusive interviews. We've got 4 of those coming up right after the main stage. And the event here in Boston has about 50 breakout sessions. Those have already begun this morning. The sessions are focused on every angle of the ESG, finance, transition finance, and sustainability story. So this morning, I did not get to go to all of these, but we've had some sessions on the ESG ecosystem, corporate reporting, the investor view, natural capital, the policy landscape. I attended a session, a breakout session called Carbon Accounting Brings Climate Accountability. So this was a session that was moderated by Asheen Fonze, who's an old friend of GreenBiz. And what I really appreciated about this session was that it brought us to the discussion of how transparency is no longer being executed on for its own purposes. We're now executing on transparency to bring about impact and action around climate. So it's a little bit of a shift in mentality.
I went to a session this morning, and I have to say, I ran into our CFO in the elevator this morning, headed to that accounting session, and he was so excited. And I just love how this event brings these different professions within the sustainability world that GreenBiz has been in for so long. This morning I went to a session too. The one that I went to was called The Role of Private Equity in Decarbonizing Transitioning Assets. The reason that I chose that one is because it was moderated by Molly Wood, who is just fantastic. She's a former NPR Marketplace reporter, and she just has such this amazing way of capturing information and repeating it back, and I just love her style. The conversation itself was fascinating. I was surprised at how fascinating it was, and it really made me think about sort of the maturation of how we're talking about the finance world when it comes to sustainability, because it was like we're starting to get a feel for the best way to be talking about these things and where we need to go. And what's so cool about this event is how it started so early on in this ESG impact investing world. So we're watching this like transition and how we talk about things in real time. So I really enjoyed that.
It's a really engaging world to be a part of, and one that has its own language. So as you're mentioning, Sarah, the way that we talk about finance, the way we talk about its interaction with sustainability is constantly changing. And I think you'll, if you're playing along at home, you can listen for how many times folks mention the term alphabet soup, and also you can count the number of acronyms that folks use and initialisms that our speakers use, because it is a world of initials. No one ever wants to speak all of the names of everything that we're talking about. In the breakout session that I'll be moderating on Wednesday, we're going to do some acronym trivia. So I had fun coming up with some fake definitions for some of these initialisms.
I remember last year from the main stage, Mindy Lubber, who heads up Ceres, she had this line where she said, we won't be able to change the world if we're using our own secret language. And so I think that there's also this process of figuring out how to make these terms accessible, because I think the concepts are actually pretty accessible, but when they're sort of behind like a sheen of needing to learn a new vernacular, now alphabet soup, then it gets like really tricky to
completely
figure
agree.
out. Yeah. So you're also going to be on the keynote today.
Yes.
What are you working on?
So I am excited to close out the keynote program today with an interview with the Treasurer of the State of Vermont, Mike Pichek, and with Stephen Rothstein, who is Managing Director of the Corporate Sustainable Finance Accelerator at Ceres. So it should be a really good conversation about how we're actually proactively talking about ESG in the marketplace.
Well, without further ado, let's get on with the main stage.
welcome to the stage Director, Sustainable Finance and ESG, Grant Harrison.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon, GreenFin community. It is such a pleasure to see so many familiar faces through these very bright lights since we last hosted our inaugural GreenFin event 363 days ago. That is about 3.8 parts per million of atmospheric CO2 ago, to place us more squarely in time, space, and purpose. If this is your inaugural GreenFin event, would you mind doing one of these for me? Oh, wow. Right on. Welcome in, welcome home. Wicked Pissa, go Sox. It's great to have you here in Boston. Now, first and foremost, there are seats up here for those of you standing who would prefer to sit. I see a bunch right here. You can take them. I do not need to describe to this room full of practitioners just what type of change and how much change has taken place these last 363 days. Something like tailwinds, broadening recognition that this is the largest economic opportunity in the history of economic opportunities, compelled by an existential crisis that makes it totally necessary. And then some headwinds and some pushback and some ideological disinformation and misinformation, and it's a weird place to be in. The opportunity has not changed. Of course, the work has not ceased, but it's also weird. And weird, of course, does not do justice at all to the complexity of the causes of this current state we find ourselves in. The world has always been an infinitely complex place. It was long before our species showed up and started meddling with stuff. But it has been especially complex for us and for the species that we share this planet with ever since we decided to grow our food, build cities, begin to manipulate our environment to suit our needs, and relevant for this audience, to begin to quantifiably and measurably ascribe value to stuff. And it is definitely not the most romantic conception of our shared human history that one could offer, but it is worth remembering that our distant cousins back in Mesopotamia, remember them? They invented writing not to capture the beauty and awe that one can find in this complexity I'm talking about, or the beauty and awe that one can find so easily in their fellow Mesopotamian, but instead to track transactions. Sarah Cefalu owes Taylor Flores 7 goats. Taylor Flores owes Eric Farrow 27 bushels of wheat, and I owe the entire GreenFin audience the next, 7 years of my lentil crop. Is that a fair transaction? I don't know, but it's been recorded. I've got it right here in cuneiform. And buried in all this complexity is some real clarity when it comes to the intersection of how we've manipulated our environment, how we have ascribed and accounted for the value of stuff, and why we all convene here in the first place. And that is, among other things, emissions continue to rise, species continue to perish at an alarming rate, a mass extinction rate. Those who are least responsible for causing the climate to change continue to be the most vulnerable to the impacts of its changes. And all that is to say, the case for and need for allocating capital sustainably and toward sustainability has never been more obvious. I was on this stage, 363 days ago, talking about how this thing that you're all assembling is something of a Trojan horse for the woke agenda. And since then, that vague association with a big wooden horse has morphed into a very well-funded and well-orchestrated campaign to ensure that we keep our collective economic head buried in the sand, to shield it from the emissions that are causing environmental degradation here in reality, where so many of us live, at great human cost and great economic cost. And for others, maybe we're still rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. We're just doing it now while huffing wildfire smoke. There is common ground. I'm not going to try to point you to it. I'll let our first keynote conversation do that for you. But before we get into the program, I am excited and honored to have with us America's first Green New Deal mayor, here to give you a proper welcome to Beantown, who will hopefully forgive me for my wicked pissa and my go Sox. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Boston's Mayor Michelle Wu. All right.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much, Grant, for all that you and everyone at GreenViz does every day to make sure that we are telling stories that can amplify our power to build the future that we deserve. And welcome to Boston, everyone. I am thrilled and grateful that you're here. I'm here in my capacity as mayor of this great city to say thank you for all that you do to help us envision, fund, and innovate towards that world of the future. But I'm also here as a mom of 2 young boys who just wrapped up school last week, so we're in this crazy juggling period before summer camp starts. And as a mom, you think all the time in multiple time scales. Right, is at the ages of 5 and 8, it's a little better now. No more diaper changes, no more this and that, but you're still constantly worrying. Are their hands clean? Are they fed? Are they happy? Do they have what they need right now? And in the same breath, are we building the world to what they will grow into one day? What will life be like when they're stepping into their own roles, raising a family, having a home of their own, and how am I preparing them as young people now for that future that they're going to live and inherit one day? At the City of Boston, we understand that all of those time scales and all of the issues that our residents are dreaming of and struggling with are deeply intertwined. The push for more affordability when it comes to housing, the investments in job training and making sure that we are bringing jobs of the future to this city, the investment in our schools so that we can be proud of all of the opportunities our young people have, and the many ways in which we're trying to connect all of them with public transportation and our transportation infrastructure. But all of that rests on having a future that is livable, that our kids can step into and inherit. And so we are so thankful that we have partners in trying to innovate, to do this faster, to think more boldly, to help fund and de-risk and invest in the very changes that we know are needed now to build the pathway for our kids to thrive. And so we've committed in our city, for example, to going fossil fuel free in public housing by the end of the decade. We are implementing one of the most protective and all-encompassing city ordinances that will help shift our big buildings to be resilient and energy efficient and zero emissions as quickly as possible. We're looking to implement changes when it comes to transportation and affordable housing and how our built environment can reflect the future starting right now, not just making sure that we will have to continue to retrofit into the future. And all of this depends on finding the sources of funding and investment that can sustain it. So we're very grateful to have many, many opportunities opened up with the Inflation Reduction Act and to be using our American Rescue Plan dollars to focus on the intersection of climate with housing and transportation and jobs and education. We're very grateful that our state administration, Governor Healy, has created the very first Massachusetts Climate Bank that will be focused on housing in particular and how to retrofit and provide sustainable spaces. And we're excited to partner with all of you. So as you are here enjoying our city, please get the chance to take in what we're so proud of in Boston, a community that has such heart, where people come from all over the world for big ideas that can change the world. And please leave behind some of your heart here, some of your ideas and innovations. Please stay connected with us because we need all of our best ingenuity, thinking, and action when it comes to building that future for our kids and beyond. Thank you for being here.
Thank you again so much. All right. Well, with that warm welcome to Beantown, I am excited to welcome the host for our first keynote conversation, who's going to point us to that common ground I referenced. He is a former professor at Harvard Business School, visiting professor at Oxford's Said Business School, founding chairman of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and dedicated powerlifter, among other titles. Dr. Bob Eccles, please join me in welcoming to the stage. Bob.
All right. Sure, I was just going to stand up there behind the curtain.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah. I can also flip a 550-pound tire
5 times in a row.
Can you flip this?
Boy, that'd be easy. That'd be easy. That's nothing, Leo. Let me introduce my very good friend, Leo Strine. Leo was a judge in Delaware for 21 years. He was the Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court for 6 years. He's a senior fellow at Penn Law School. He's of counsel at Wachtell Lipton. And in his words, not mine, he writes too much shit on corporate governance. Did I get that right?
I mean, I would never cuss, but, you know.
So let's do, the thing we do, Leo. I think we need to start with a little poll. I mean, there's been a lot of talk in this conference about anti-ESG and the pushback and Republicans. How many people in this 900-person audience, how many Republicans?
I think there's a few.
So try that again. There's 900 people in this audience. Okay, I'm just like maybe.
I think there's one.
Maybe one. Let's make it a bit easier. How many people know a Republican?
Okay, Eamon, how many of you, just interesting, how many of you are independents? A few more. No, that's interesting.
You're Massachusetts, man. Well, I guess these people are from all over. So let's get into it. One of the big debates, in these culture wars is clearly around climate. And look, you're an expert on this, Leo. So there's this big question, right? What is the responsibility that companies have for climate, within the fiduciary duty they have to the corporation and the shareholders? What's reasonable to expect that companies can be doing when it comes to climate?
I think one of the things we might leave you with today in thinking about this issue, and also why we kind of asked you about whether you know Republicans or your companies, is we're a diverse nation, right? And part of that diversity is also diversity of thought, that you're allowed to have, right, differences of opinion. That's part of kind of an essential part of the animating vision of a just society. And so you have to think about these issues, realizing that diversity, and also that different institutions have different purposes. Right? And businesses, none of us would be comfortable having businesses become orthodoxies, right? There are many communities in which there aren't that many employers. I don't know about you, but I often spend more of my waking hours of my life under the roof of my employer than I do with my family when you're awake, right? And so it's important that we have places of employment that are tolerant and where people of different beliefs can come together. And as long as they come together in good faith and treat each other well, that's okay. They can have differences of belief. When we think about climate or any kind of issues, part of what's been happening with this debate is, do companies have the legitimacy, right, to speak for everybody about divisive issues? And you have to think about that, and part of why we asked is you have to think about that when you're on the other side of the issue, right? When a company is going to say something or may impose something on its employees or an orthodoxy that you don't believe in. And so what I've been talking about is thinking of ESG really as making money the right way. And what we mean by that, Bob, is are your products and services safe and not fraudulent? Do they make people's lives better? Do your employees come to work and have a safe place to work? Do you treat them well and pay them well so they can make a better life for their family? Do you pay your taxes in your community and support the local institutions? Do you avoid polluting the environment? When you think about it that way, and you think about climate in that lens, it becomes less divisive, because polls show that overwhelming percentages of all Americans think that companies should do those things. And so when you think about climate, I think, well, it's an aspect of, frankly, do we not pollute the environment? It is a form of pollution. And it's also for companies in every industry, and we should break this down a little bit, but in companies in many industries, this is a core business risk. Not all industries are the same. But for some industries, climate is an existential business risk that they have to front. My firm, we represent a reinsurer and their primary form of reinsurance is catastrophe storm insurance. how is it that they could run their company, right, without thinking about that, about climate? They would, in the words of this debate, I would say that the folks, Governor DeSantis, if you take his logic, it would be a breach of fiduciary duty for the reinsurer not to think about that, right? Because he wants them to focus on their stockholders. Well, if you don't set your premiums correctly and you mismatch risk, you're going to fail as an insurer and your stockholders are going to lose all their money. And so one of the lenses, and we don't have a lot of time to think of this, if you can fit climate, and the same thing for institutional investors is...
Because they're the ones that are getting most of the pushback. Right,
they are.
And they've got GFANs and net zero targets and they want Scope 3. So what is their role? Because they have...
But again, I think they have to think about it, and this is the legitimacy thing, right, which is we don't give our money over to Vanguard, BlackRock, or State Street, right? And most of us are forced investors for 401k, or if you're saving for your kid, 529. We don't have shared political purposes. BlackRock and State Street don't have legitimacy on political grounds, and nor, frankly, do companies. But what they do have an obligation to do is to think about climate risk as an enlightened investor. And to the extent that climate risk is huge, and for example, you're representing retirement investors, that's long-term, 529, that's long-term. You're representing index investors who own a basket of the economy. Externality risks hurt your investors. They're going to bear the long-term cost because they don't buy and sell, right? They don't sell out of these stocks. So the long-term risks are going to eventuate and be borne by their investors. And of course they should be thinking in a business-like way about risks that confront their portfolio company, and to the extent that they have an obligation under the law, and they do, to vote their shares and to engage in certain stewardship efforts, then they should, of course, engage on things that are material to those companies' future. And I don't understand how, as a fiduciary, they can avoid doing that. I think we have to own it, though, right? That's different from setting up an ESG fund, where you say, this is a socially responsible fund. Our view is we, frankly, are willing even to sacrifice some rate of return for our values. And you invest in us knowing that, right? That fund, obviously, has been candid. And it seems to me that that fund can do that. That's a lot different than running a pension fund, right? If you're running a pension fund, you don't get to do that really with other people's money. But part of what's confusing the debate is you also don't get to run a pension fund on witchcraft. Something Massachusetts is familiar with.
It's a core competence. We're pretty proud of it. I mean, we're pretty proud of it. We've got a distinguished history.
It's a strength. No, I mean, you actually, right, one of the things about climate is when two groups of people believe something, you might, and they're not the group of people that you would most associate with sort of wearing Birkenstocks. First, scientists, okay? But say that you think all the scientists are, love trees, love everything, would never mess with anything, because none of the things that have harmed the environment were brought to you by science, right? I'm from the state of DuPont, right? Is actuaries, right? Insurance actuaries are absolutely convinced of the human impact on climate change and the resulting effect of climate change on weather volatility, storms, and risk, right? If you're running a pension fund, don't you have a duty to listen to facts? If you're investing in insurance sectors, if you're investing in hotel companies that have most of their hotels in coastal communities or something, don't you have a duty, a fiduciary duty, to actually think about climate in that context, not in any untraditional way, not because you're trying to make the world a better place, but because the objective reality of climate change is going to have an impact on your investments and on the health of those companies, and you have a duty to your investors to do it.
But here's what puzzles me, Leo. You've got science on your side, you've got clear rules around fiduciary duty, engaging around that. The right, some, not all, is saying that these engagements are a political agenda. So how do we cut through that?
Well,
right? I mean, this is like a common problem.
part of it,
There's these like two narratives going on that aren't connecting.
But they are, I mean, they're interesting because I'm a person of the left, okay? Confess that. Never got scared by Ronald Reagan out of calling himself, an FDR, MLK, LBJ liberal. I'm a liberal. I wasn't scared. I didn't have to use the Teddy Roosevelt word that starts with a P. But I respect that there are people who have different beliefs than me. I, as a Democrat, definitely do not believe that people elect corporate directors because they're representative of the American people. I actually have long opposed one of my white whales, to stay with the New England theme. One of my white whales is Citizens United. I think corporations should leave the political issues to the human beings and not use money that they have for other reasons. Any of you invest in your 401k as an expression of your political beliefs? Any of you believe that Vanguard or BlackRock or Fidelity can take their diverse investors' political views and shape them into input to companies? Of course not. We've seen companies, right, speak out on issues that mean a lot to many of us, things like voting rights, things like guns, things like reproductive choice, right? We may like that companies say this, but when the same companies have given tens of millions of dollars to the political committees and candidates who put in place those laws, when the political spending of companies is so unrepresentative of the general public, you get a hypocrisy factor, right? Why is it that they're able to give this money? And then when you speak out, do we even really think you mean what you say if you speak out situationally because it seems like the momentary thing to do, use the company's money to sign on to some newspaper ad, but then you're pouring millions of dollars into the political process and on the other side of the issue? That doesn't help anybody. And I think one of the issues is we also get the thing where Democrats will say to companies, stay out of politics, don't give contributions, but then boycott entire American states. And one of the things I pointed out in an article, it's like, North Carolina, 45% of the people are pro-choice. 45% of the people will probably have the position that many of you share on voting rights. Are you going to boycott the whole state so that where do they work then? Or do you engage, there are things, but then on the Republican side, right, they want companies to shut up.
But give them money.
But then feed the pig trough. Right? And what I'm saying is that both sides then look hypocritical. Business leaders have enough to do. See, one of the things I would argue about is that we're letting business leaders off the hook by giving them credit for popping off situationally. That the main thing that a business leader can do to make the world a better place is, does the business treat its workers well? Does it respect the environment? Are its consumers better off and not harmed by what we do? Do we pay our taxes and fund our schools, or do we, instead of seeking tax abatements, just to keep a thing open? Running a good business is hard. Having a good DEI climate within a company where everybody feels welcome. Making sure that your employees have reproductive choice in your plans and facilitating it. Making sure your employees can send their kids to college and are economically secure. Those are not easy things to do and to make a profit, right? That's what business leaders actually control. That's why they're elected. And I think one of the things about the conversation we're having about, the very important conversation we're having about climate is, the more you can help frame issues in ways that align people. Part of why I use the word pollution. My article, Republicans, I fish, a lot of people in my family over time have hunted, right? The Republicans often claim people who hunt and fish as their own. Many Democrats hunt and fish, so many independents. But if you look at polls of people who hunt and fish, they believe climate change is real. They are very strongly against corporate pollution. So framing how you talk about issues, talking about them in tangible ways. Look, there's things going on. It's very hot right now in weird places of the world, right? A town caught on fire outside London. What's going on in Texas right now? The North Atlantic, the storms. It's causing real harm. Focusing people on real things. And And I'll tell you about climate. One of my things is I wanted the SEC to very much to do the climate change release, but I wanted them to do workforce disclosure at the same time. Being conscious that the hardworking people who work in the energy producing industries, in energy producing regions of the country, are no more responsible for climate change than we are as consumers. I like to be cool in the summer. It's nice to have the air conditioning in it. And did you go outside today? Feels a little warm. Feels a little better in here. A lot of hot air coming out of Strine. I still, by the way, I do the most environmentally responsible thing. I drive my car as long as I can. It's a hybrid. So I don't have electric yet because it is actually more environmentally responsible to not create a new car. But we sometimes don't, we talk about climate and we talk about things in ways that divide unnecessarily. And we should be talking about the connection with working people bringing them along. One of the reasons why the climate bill got done and things got done is that people like the president and my senior senator, Senator Carper, who's been incredibly helpful to fighting climate change, got a hydrofluorocarbon ban done during the Trump administration. He worked with Republicans to do that. He worked for 5 years with the BRT and the Environmental Defense Fund. Is that building bridges and understanding and the funding in the climate bill to bring along communities is important.
So we're down into the yellow zone.
And we are going to actually leave with 10 seconds.
We're going to nail this. So any admonitions you have to the group about what they could do when they leave this conference?
I do. I think thinking about this, being conscious about whether, when you're a company or an institutional investor, whether you are really looking at it from a business perspective, whether you're an investor or whatever, if you're looking at it as an environmentalist, as a cause thing, think about the role, is that for you, and think about whether you're respecting diversity of choice. And what I mean is, I think if you think about this, you're a citizen, you get to speak your mind. But when you have other people's money and you have a different role, you just have to realize that does come with responsibility. And I think if we're not careful, we play into the divisiveness. I think this idea about, we're talking about common ground. Bob is doing a lot of great work reaching out to people across the other side. What I said about my senior senator, you may never have heard of him. He did incredible things. You want to know the infrastructure bill, remember how it got done? Well, you know part of why it was? He went to the ranking member on his committees, the chair of Environment and Public Works, and he said to her before the election, one of us is going to be chair. Infrastructure is not a partisan issue. It's necessary for our nation's economy. It's necessary for the environment. It's necessary for jobs. Let's agree on a schedule before we know which one of us will be chair. And we'll honor it. We'll honor it. When Tom became chair, because he honored the schedule, the infrastructure bill passed unanimously out of his committee. It was the core of that. It takes years to do this. He doesn't, and what I'm saying is there are people, and you can be that, when you reach out and you build common ground. I think that's the best thing. There won't always be enough of it, but there's plenty of it that we can build on.
So one quick thing from me. So I'm going out, I'm meeting Republicans. It's fascinating, right? I mean, there's the kind of crazy shit, right, that you get, from the lunatic. The ones I'm talking to, they're sensible, they're reasonable, they think climate change is real, they have different views about how to address it. It's telling that there was maybe 1 or 2 people in this room who are Republicans. So my admonition to you is go out, and I'm dead serious about this, start making friends with Republicans. Because if we don't do it all together, it's not going to happen.
Thank you all.
All right. Thank you, Bob and Leo, for setting us on some solid ground for today's keynote. Next up, we have with us longtime sustainable investing champion, impact provocateur, and I'm told actually Bob Eccles' day husband, one of her titles, Erica Karp. Please join me in welcoming to the stage, Erica. All right.
So there's not that many people that scare the shit out of me, but he's one of them. So, oh, I started that way, I'm sorry. Okay, so I was going to talk about investing with first principles today. And what that means is thinking about the foundation from which all knowledge is derived. That's Socrates. First principle, the basis from which everything is known. First principles, it stands alone. It's the company. It's the truth. So I was going to talk about my worries. My worries that, there's so much noise out there. My worries that in the field of sustainable investing, sometimes we might be losing the forest for the trees. I was going to say that, ESG investing, there's no such thing. There's no such thing. There is such a thing as ESG analysis, and you can do any kind of investing you want. It is a tool. It is a discipline. So I was going to talk about that a little bit. I was going to talk about the fact that even though we know what ESG analysis is, we might be moving away from first principles, the company. So these days we look around and there's so much, again, so much information, and there's all the data, and there's ratings, and there's rankings, and there's algorithms, and indices, there's ETFs and mutual funds, frameworks. There's a lot of stuff, but remember the company. So I worry again that we're moving away. And because a lot of the information we use out there, it's reasoning by analogy. It's derivative information. And again, sometimes we forget the company. So that's what I was going to talk about today. And then I was on my way here and I changed my mind. And Grant does give me the liberty to do that. So what I was thinking about on my way over was why I'm here. And so I was reminded of a quote from Mark Twain. And Mark Twain said, the two most important days of a person's life are the day they were born and the day they figure out why. So pretty cool. Now, what I'm thinking is that who knows if I'm ever going to know why. But I tell you what I do know. I know why I was not born. I was not born to stand by and watch thousands of species go extinct every year. I was not born to watch Manhattan go red from crazy, insane wildfires in the north. I was not born to watch multiple crises. Healthcare, obviously climate, a crisis in confidence, a crisis in mental health that brings misery to millions. I was not born to look at corporations go for not the best governance, for not looking at the material, environmental, and social issues. I was not born for those things. So I was thinking, why am I really here? I think, I learn, and hopefully I create, and hopefully all of us can encourage the world to pay attention. All right, we're in the attention economy. There's so much out there we need to focus. Pay attention to what you pay attention to. So I think that's one of the reasons we're here. I think we can help the world look at things on an intersectional basis. You can't get women's economic empowerment in a vacuum. SDG number 5. You need to get women access to water and education and healthcare and capital and broadband. One SDG, one Sustainable Development Goal, is not achievable in and of itself. So I'm here to help encourage people to think about the intersectionality. I feel like we can be here to help challenge assumptions, a la going back to first principles. And I think that we can all be here to be kind. And not just kind to our clients and our friends and our families, we can be kind to ourselves. And again, that's thinking ourselves, a human being, as first principles. You know, there's another quote that I was hearing about from Twain as I'm having a conversation with ChatGPT, and they said to me, it's not a he or she, I'm not going to genderize ChatGPT. They said to me that Mark Twain wrote that we are all born totally ignorant, but it takes a great deal of work to remain stupid. So I'm thinking a great deal of work. I'm thinking it must be exhausting to fight against all the science of climate change. It must be exhausting to not understand that with social media and big data, everything swirling around, transparency is coming and it is transformational. That must be exhausting. It must be exhausting to ignore the demands of the next generations of investors who insist on transparency, who deserve our digging them out from the, basically having mortgaged their future. That must be exhausting to fight against there. And it also must be exhausting to hope that companies don't think about great governance. So working against the truth must be exhausting. So part of me almost makes me feel sorry for them. No. So let's come back to first principles. For some reasons, dinosaurs just came to mind. So dinosaurs. It's interesting, it took a while, but the dinosaurs are gone now. Except for those that evolved into birds. So that's interesting. We can't study dinosaurs by first principle because all the fossils are not actually bone fragments, they're minerals and stone, and so we can't study dinosaurs by first principles. We can study birds that way, and we can hopefully understand them, we can learn from them, we can evolve, and we can fly like them. The birds want to survive and thrive. The birds know why they're here. And I think many of us do as well. So, I just want to say thank you for allowing me to have a few words. I think that the dinosaurs, again, will be left by the wayside. And I think you all will drive capitalism towards its best and highest purpose. So have a great conference, and I'll talk to you all afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Mark Twain, via ChatGPT. Next up, we have our first panel of the day, and I'm candidly very excited to have this conversation hosted by a media figure you might know from some of your favorite NPR shows, Marketplace, Marketplace Tech, Make Me Smart. Now the founder of the eponymous Molly Wood Media. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Molly Wood.
Good afternoon. It's not just me. I have an illustrious panel. I'm very excited for this because it is near and dear to my nerdy little heart. I am delighted to be on stage with Alex Wright-Gladstein, immediately to my right, the founder and CEO of Sphere, like the planet, and before that, IR Labs, which is enabling energy-efficient computing, kind of a big deal in the age of AI. I also have Vanessa Fagins-Turner, who's the executive director of Bank Forward and the co-founder and principal at Investable Oceans. And we are going to be talking about this idea of the financial supply chain. And in the interest of time, I think what we're going to do to explain the financial supply chain is start by blowing your minds a little bit with some numbers. So let's see, do we have a, yep, okay. Vanessa, kick us off.
I get to blow your minds first. Who here has a bank account? That's a trick question. That's right. Well, 24% of the dollars that large Wall Street banks lend out from our deposits touch on fossil fuels and other carbon-intensive sectors. 24%.
Okay. Continue, the mind-blowing Alex.
Yeah, it is a wild number.
You have to one-up me, though.
Who here has a 401k or 403b or similar retirement savings account? Also, probably everyone. And what a lot of people don't realize is that the emissions of those are enormous. Mercer came out with a study in September showing that on average, the financed emissions from 401ks are 33 times higher than the direct emissions of companies, meaning the scope 1 and 2. So 33 times more emissions from 401ks than from the companies themselves.
Now we're getting a little competitive here. So we went from 24 to 33, and now we have upwards of 90% or more, which is the increase in emissions that companies would experience were they to factor in the financed emissions of their publicly disclosed cash holdings. So whatever is on a company's 10K, looked at based on their bank, their emissions would increase 90 to 112%. This is based on averages of Silicon Valley tech companies.
Because they have a lot of cash. So hopefully, let's dig into how this is happening. What is it in the financial supply chain that is causing what are effectively hidden emissions by companies? Alex, I'll start with you.
So when you look at 401ks, it's really looking at the emissions of the companies that they're investing in. And because all 401ks are diversified across the economy, and in fact, even if you don't want to diversify across the entire economy, for example, if you don't want to invest in the fossil fuel industry, let's say, which is on a decline, we should hope, I think we all think in this room it's on the decline, might not be the best financial investment, but 99% of people don't even have an option to avoid that type of investment in 401ks. And so as a result, we're investing in very carbon-intensive industries in our 401ks, and that's why those numbers can be so much higher than the direct emissions of companies themselves.
In fact, talk about how high those numbers can be, right? You have told me in the past, I've interviewed Alex several times because I'm obsessed with this topic, that 401k and retirement investments can account for as much of a third of fossil fuel investments right now?
Oh, yeah, yes.
Yep.
So there are about $1 trillion, depending on how you measure, but about $1 trillion invested in fossil fuel companies from retirement investments in the United States. And that $1 trillion is equivalent to about a third of the market cap of fossil fuel companies. So it's an incredibly important source of capital for the fossil fuel industry.
Right. If you wanted to be invested in that in your 401k, fine, but in this case, you're effectively being forced to.
That's right.
Maybe not fine, but you know what I mean. And then Vanessa, help us understand this 91% to 112% in the context of banking, which is your arena of expertise.
Yeah, we often think about decarbonizing our financial supply chain or greening our finances by thinking about what we hear is divestment or changing our investments over. Usually in the investments we can control the most, not the 401k arena. But what we're not looking at is the fact that our deposits or our more liquid assets, in bonds and other asset classes, are usually up for discretionary use by banks in their lending activities, which means that these activities and our cash deposits are being used for these banks' activities, whatever they may be. And for Wall Street banks, the largest 6 banks in the United States, which are JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, and Goldman Sachs, 24% of dollars they're lending out are going to some degree of fossil fuel company.
So I think the reason that we say this is this next frontier and a new frontier is because you as a company or an investor or a capital allocator or whatever your role is here at this conference can be doing a lot of things right and can be having a lot of leakage. that you're not aware of, and that leakage is your money, your financial supply chain. So,
and not just leakage, but impact. I think we think about impact in terms of corporate responsibility, in terms of financial allocation, our investments, our philanthropy, and our sort of activities within those realms. We're not thinking about our banking or our 401ks and our other financial products and materials, which actually, as we see here with 91 to 112%, are accounting for vast majority, sometimes more than many of our other emission-related activities.
Right, absolutely. So it's not leakage, it's in fact opportunity, which is what, so we've blown your minds and now we're here to talk about how we can make this a little bit better. Let's start with this Bank Forward tool.
Bank Forward's partnered with Green Portfolio and the Outdoor Policy Outfit and several other great partners, our data partner South Pole, to produce a calculator that helps individuals and companies at the rough level estimate what the emissions of their cash holdings would be. Right now, we have 6 main banks worth of data. In a month and a half, we will have over 20, and soon we will have even more data for as many banks as possible that allow you to input what cash holdings you have at a specific bank and shoot out what your associated emissions are and how much you can reduce your emissions by moving money to a greener bank. And there are several options there. That's the key opportunity here, that in fact, if you are looking to make and reach a net zero goal, this tool is helping you understand how much you can save, and pretty quick changes if moving money is an option.
Is the tool designed for companies, for consumers, for all?
Right now, the tool is designed for individuals, and it doesn't allow for you to break down your asset classes. We will soon have a version that allows for more sophisticated financial differentiation. So right now, it's a pretty plug-and-play tool in beta, and we'll have the new version certainly by Climate Week in September, and probably be piloting it before then.
Perfect. All right, and then Alex, tell us what you're working on.
So at Sphere, we have a platform we're developing called the Atmosphere that helps sustainability teams of companies measure the emissions from their 401ks and understand how to reduce those, which involves not just modeling what 401k emissions could be if certain fund options were to be replaced, but also understanding how to engage with the benefits team, with the people who have the fiduciary responsibility for 401ks, how to use their language, because sustainability teams oftentimes don't really know that language of fiduciary duty that the benefits team speaks. And so this tool really helps empower the sustainability team to go make changes.
Well, and talk about, as we have learned somewhat painfully recently, it is very easy to move your money if you want to. It is not as easy to change 401k plans in some cases, and like you said, to sort of engage your sustainability team with this question of financial supply chain, which feels like two totally different parts of the house. How does this tool then help lead to that kind of change, and what needs to happen to get better 401k options for people?
Yeah, it's interesting. When you talk to people in the financial industry, more often than not, the vast majority of people in finance even don't really understand what goes into making 401k lineup decisions. And that's because it is a pretty niche industry within finance, and it's different than the rest of finance. It has some very specific rules from the Department of Labor regulating how 401k lineup decisions have to be made. And I think it can oftentimes feel overwhelming to people once they stick a toe in it, like, oh my gosh, this seems impossible to change. And so this tool is really meant to help empower people to not get intimidated by that and to really lean in. And it all comes down to that language of fiduciary responsibility. And there's a very real legal requirement for the members of the 401k committee, which is a committee at any company typically that decides what funds go in a lineup. It typically meets quarterly, and they have a very real fiduciary responsibility to make sure that the options in that lineup are priced competitively with their benchmarks. They have good performance compared to their benchmarks. And if they're not on top of that, there are lawsuits that take place all the time in the 401k industry. And so that's why bringing together that language of climate with that language of fiduciary responsibility is so important.
Right. And both of these fundamentally, I think, are an awareness play. It is about helping people understand that there is such a thing, one, as a financial supply chain, two, that you can have some impact as an individual and an individual in a company saying, I want these different options. How did you both, very quickly before we talk a little bit more about your tools, how did you both arrive at these solutions? Vanessa, I'll start with you.
We have been looking for a finances driving, as everyone in this room knows, our key decisions around climate, and looking also at some of the barriers to making and scaling progress. And as we look towards shifting large amounts and flows of capital towards green solutions, we have to also understand where our capital is going now. And we like to say, as I know Alex does too, if you can measure it, you can manage it. And understanding first where the money that we aren't specifically allocating or managing, understanding that it's actually not neutral, but in fact has a purpose and is having an impact even if we don't know about it. So we work a lot with individuals who are thinking about their personal financial impacts and thinking about individual donations, 5% or more if they have a foundation, or perhaps 1% of their net wealth, which is quite generous compared to the national average. If you're giving away that amount of money, then compare that with where your cash or other liquid assets are having impact. If they're in a large bank that is allocating up to 24% of assets towards fossil fuels, even if you're giving all 1% or all 5% or more towards climate philanthropy, and if you have some portion of your portfolio and investments in green assets, you are still largely undermining your own personal choices. And this is about getting to a net effect and a net positive impact that helps people make the most of their money. That's what we're here to do.
Mm-hmm. I came at this from the perspective of a plan sponsor, as it's known in the 401k industry. So this is my second company. My first company, we spun a technology out of MIT that helps make data centers and supercomputers more energy efficient by using light to move data between chips. And as a climate tech company, I thought it was a no-brainer to ask our 401k providers, when we set one up back in 2017, for a climate-friendly investment option in the plan. And it took over 3 years and a lot of persistence to get a single climate-friendly option. And so that is where my journey started, of just trying to talk to as many people as I could in the 401k industry to learn why is it so hard to do climate-friendly investing in 401ks.
Yep. And now you have a fund that is available for 401k managers should they want to add it.
That's right. So in addition to the Atmosphere tool, we have what I call the easy button for benefits managers, a climate-friendly fund that's designed to check the boxes of what they look for from a fiduciary perspective. And it's called the Sphere 500 Climate Fund, and none of this is investment advice.
It may be investment suggestion. Inception. I'm going to stop before I get us all sued. So finally, I know that everyone in this room has a lot on their plates when it comes to managing net zero commitments and figuring out what to tackle next, which I think leads us to our kind of closing question, which is, why are we talking about this right now? What is coming down that is going to make this actually a pretty acute issue for companies?
Well, you've heard it here, not first, but if you haven't been looking, as the nerds among us have been, at the greenhouse gas protocol, which I know several of you in the audience are quite involved with and helping lead, or other types of disclosure discussions, some of these key frameworks, like the greenhouse gas protocol, which is the global leading framework for measuring and reporting emissions for corporations, for cities, and for a lot of organizations and nonprofits, then they're reviewing their standards and likely to begin requesting reporting based on investments, and as part of investments, reporting on all financed emissions within Scope 3 category. It's technically going to be part of Scope 3, Category 15, which is called the investments category, and they're reviewing what will be required or recommended reporting. And it looks like your financed emissions and financial supply chains will be increasingly, not just on the radar, but increasingly part of standard reporting. This means that the 91% increase in emissions over what companies were already reporting is potentially coming down the pipeline. Those numbers are quite high based on the fact that lots of technology companies are very cash rich. That may not be the case for many of the companies here, which are largely investing, but it's still worth knowing and getting ahead of now so that that number doesn't come as a big surprise.
Yeah, I personally found it shocking when I first started Sphere. I was talking to a lot of people, not just 401k advisors, but also employees at big companies, at the big tech companies. There are entire movements of employees who've been asking for climate-friendly investment options in their 401ks for many years. And whenever I approach people on sustainability teams at companies and brought up this issue, they would act very personally interested and think, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. This is so important. I wish I could spend time on this. But they didn't feel they could spend their work hours on it because it wasn't something they were measured by. And a lot of companies, sustainability teams, do work towards the reporting as measured by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is what the EU points to. It's what the SEC is thinking about pointing to for the guidelines on how to measure emissions. And so the fact that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is now likely to start including the financial supply chain for the first time, not just financed emissions from a product perspective, but from the supply chain perspective, which includes bank accounts and 401ks, is exciting because for the first time, sustainability teams, now that they're hearing this, they're coming to us and saying, oh, wow, now this is something that I need to pay attention to. Can you help me understand what are the emissions from our 401k and how do we go about improving that before we start having to report this?
Exactly. This is going to be, what we'd love to see is that financed emissions and financial supply chain emissions accounting are a part of every sustainability plan. It can be its own pillar because ultimately they are very impactful. And I think luckily there are starting to be a large number of solutions and alternatives that I know many of the tech companies are looking into, and we're grateful to have Alex leading the charge on one of them.
So please consider this notice. You are officially on notice with respect to your financial supply chain. Vanessa, Alex, thank you so much. And of course, the resources that we talked about are at this website, bankforward.org/greenfin23. Appreciate you two so much.
Thank you so much, Molly.
All right. Thank you, Molly and team, for an insightful conversation and putting you all on notice. Next up, we have an interactive simulation brought to you by someone whose work you might be familiar with, 5 or so miles away from here at the MIT Sloan School. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Director of the Sustainability Initiative at MIT's Sloan School, Jason Jay.
So let's say that we were successful with everything that the panel before just talked about, and we gained control of our 401ks, and we gained control of shareholder votes, and we dug in on the question that Leo Stein raised about corporate political activity. What would we do with that power, and how would we actually create a low-carbon future? Many of us think we know the answer to that question, but what we're going to do interactively today is really explore that seriously using a tool we developed at the MIT Sloan School. The starting point for this is to remind ourselves where we are in the big picture. Raise your hand if you have seen this picture before. You haven't seen my slides before? Okay, good. Let's see, sorry. Oh, tech fail. Sorry. Let me see if I can make that work better this time. My slides are not advancing. Okay. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go straight to the question I want to pose to you. What do you think is going to help us solve global climate change? How are we going to get to a future of no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius? I want you to take out your phones, open up the URL that's at the top of the screen here, pollev.com/JasonJ, and I want you to share your thoughts. This is a word cloud poll, so you should answer with one word or a hyphenated phrase. So if it's a two-word thing, put a hyphen in between so that your responses stay together when you put your answer into the tool. We might ask you to log in or share information. You don't need to do that. You can skip the login, whatever. What action will help us limit warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius? And, I imagine you can think about this broadly, right, as you are. Excellent. So we've got some technologies coming in, like fusion and fuels. We've got political processes like collaboration and partnership. We've got a bigger picture changes to our capitalist system, like degrowth and boardroom changes and a new economic imperative. So we need systems change, not climate change, as many of you may have seen on protest signs. So this is fantastic. This is the array of solutions that we need. Now, if you put yourself in the shoes of a top decision maker, which could be those Congress people or boardroom directors or C-suite executives or investors, and you ask the question, what do I need to do to solve climate change? This is the answer that you get, okay? And your bandwidth for attention is about this wide, and you're worried about the Ukraine war and inflation and 15 other issues, and then you've got this much attentional bandwidth to think about the environment, and then you've got water pollution, air pollution, and you've got this much to think about climate. And within that aperture of attention, this is the answer that you get. So how do we make discernments among all these different possible actions of how we might tackle climate change? We've got vegetarianism, we've got investment. Someone seems to want to go to Mars, it looks like. A few folks have suggested electrification. So what we're going to do is we're going to just jump right in and start trying those things. This is an interactive simulation tool called En-ROADS. It's free, available for anyone. It's open source on the web. You can't load it on your phone, but when you have a laptop or an iPad, you can. It is parameterized to the best available science. We just did a new big model release so that it includes the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the more recent changes. It's a globally aggregated model, which means that when we make changes together here, we're going to be running experiments. And we're going to be doing it at the scale of the whole world, as if everybody did what we're going to try. So let's see. So we've got one of the things here is policy regulation, so that's kind of broad. But here's the first one I see here that in big letters is electrification. So let's take a look at what happens if we electrify. So what I can do is I can electrify transport and I can electrify buildings and industry. And what I want you to do whenever I make a change like this is to make a little prediction in your head about how big the change is going to be, and then we'll see what happens. So let's start with electrification of transport and increase that. So we can subsidize both the charging infrastructure and the vehicles. There's some electrification that's already going to happen, as you can see in these projections through 2100. And let's see what happens if we do a pretty significant increase in that electrification. Okay, so that gave us, we see this a much faster increase in electrification than we would have otherwise. If we look closely and we do our little replay button, you'll see that the band of oil here on the left is decreasing a bit. Our band of renewable energy is expanding. As a result, the greenhouse gas emissions, the fossil fuel CO2 emissions in the gray on the right here are decreasing. And as a result, we're getting 1/10 of a degree of avoided future warming. Raise your hand if that was a smaller change than you thought it was going to be. Okay? About what you expected? Raise your hand. If that was a bigger change than you thought it was going to be. Okay, so the average is that was a slightly smaller change than folks expected. But I want to get us into a little bit of a habit here, okay? We're going to solve global climate change in the next 14 minutes and 12 seconds. So every time that we get like 1/10 of a degree of improvement, I want to whoop from the audience. Is that okay? So we electrified transport. Now notice that what are the reasons why that maybe didn't have as big of an effect? Well, one thing that's going on is if we look very closely at our energy sources, there's actually, which will be a little bit easier if I bring it up in this graph form, is that when we electrify, if we haven't done anything to improve the grid, we're actually slightly increasing the amount of coal that we're burning. And so we've electrified, but we haven't changed our fuel source. So we're getting some benefits from the greater efficiency of electric vehicles, but we're still on a coal-intensive grid. And in fact, we can see that even more vividly if we look at some of the impacts of, for example, air pollution. Our electrification change is actually making air pollution slightly worse. PM 2.5 air pollution, which kills millions of people around the world every year, is predominantly due to coal burning, so we want to be careful about that. So this is a first experiment, so let's see what else we might try. I'm going to take a look at our picture here. Nuclear power, okay, this one shows up here in pretty big letters, so that means multiple people have suggested it. So let's give nuclear a shot. So here what we can do is we can increase nuclear energy. And I wanted just to get in the habit here is that whenever we're running an experiment, you could think about this as a public policy change, like a subsidy or a tax. You could think of it as a corporate action in the form of committed investment, like companies going to 100% renewable, or a civil society effort, for example, to encourage nuclear power to address the concerns that people might have about NIMBY construction issues. So let's do a subsidy on nuclear power and see what happens. All right, so what we just did was that we increased the scale of the nuclear energy industry by a factor of 7 by 2080. Okay, so massive increase in the amount of nuclear energy. And we're running a replay here so we can see. And the effect on temperature is that we got 1/10 of a degree Fahrenheit, not quite 1/10 of a degree Celsius, so maybe I just get like a whoop, but not, maybe a more mild one. So why is that? What's going on? So what we can do is we can look here on the left and we can see there's the band of nuclear energy is expanding, but what is nuclear energy substituting for? What is decreasing when nuclear energy is increasing in this picture? Just shout out what you notice. Renewables, right? So we're substituting one form of green energy or one form of low carbon energy for another. Plus, it takes a long time for that nuclear energy to ramp up. And in the interim period, we're continuing to burn fossil fuels. So that's 2 experiments. Now, someone says human extinction. Awesome. All right. So Thanos is not only in the room, but apparently is really good at poll everywhere to game the word cloud. So we're not going to pull a Thanos button here, but we can think about population. Of course, the intuition here is that population times GDP per capita times the energy intensity of GDP times the carbon intensity of final energy equals the CO2 emissions for energy. This is the famous Kaya identity. And so maybe if population were lower, so what are ethical ways other than snapping your fingers with the infinity stones would be to essentially just try educating girls and women in emerging markets, providing economic empowerment, providing reproductive health care, access, and education across genders. We know that those things work. We know that they're ethical. They achieve the SDGs, and they have the possibility of getting us to a future of an 8.8 billion population rather than a 10.4, and that's worth 0.2 of a degree. Okay, good, nice. All right, so you got the whoop going. So it's important, right? Now, some people feel that's, small. Why is that bigger or smaller than you might think? It's just important to notice that if we look at that regionally, that population bend in the curve is largely happening in other developing countries. So here we break down by US, EU, China, India, other developed and other developing countries. And you can see that that decreased birth rate in developing countries is the way that you achieve those kinds of benefits. Those are places where people are not burning a lot of carbon per capita, and so the effect isn't as dramatic or significant as some people might predict. Okay, so now that I've run a couple of experiments, you can kind of get a feel for what we're doing here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put you in control of the interface a little bit more. So keep that browser tab open to the Polev, and what I'm going to do is open up this poll, which actually is a sorry, let me pass to the next one, is a tappable image poll of the interface. And so the way this works is you will, on your phone, be able to tap on the interface where what you want Jason's next experiment to be in our conversation. And then what I will get to see is essentially where you are voting to make a change. And then that'll allow us to run a couple of more experiments. While you're registering your votes, well, actually, let me just give you a second to tap on what you would like to try next. You can start to see some of these pins and the counts for the votes in the different areas. All right, so we've got 6 votes for doing something about coal directly. So since this is an investor audience, there's a lot of different ways that we could go about reducing coal. We might tax it and so on, but what we're seeing in the investor community is a lot of concern about the financing of coal. So what if we could just cut off the lending and the project finance for coal-fired power plants? What if we could just essentially stop building new coal infrastructure? A global moratorium on financing coal-fired infrastructure. Don't shut them down, the ones that are currently running. Keep the lights on. But as we go to expand access to electricity around the world, do it in a renewable fashion. Let's see what that does. Okay, that was another 2/10 of a degree of avoided future warming. And since I showed before the importance of coal to air pollution, we'll take a quick look at the air pollution results. So if we stop financing coal emissions, that's how many lives we save, okay? Very significant, right? So often, our emphasis in these conversations is on how do we add capital to the cool new green things, right? That's part of the sexiness of coming to a GreenFin conference. But also remember that it's about, renewable energy is about keeping the lights on while we shut off the fossil fuels, right? Electric vehicles are about keeping our mobility while we retire internal combustion vehicles. So the real question is, what's going to allow us to do that? Now, let me take a look at your votes. So that was one, lot of attention on that. Now, a couple of you have said, okay, great, excellent. So now we've got a lot more votes in here for a variety of things. 25 of you want to try pricing carbon. Excellent. So let's take a look at that. And for that, I'm going to do something a little different here. I'm going to open up a fresh version of the model at the same URL that any of you could access, where you could access the tool. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try just carbon price by itself in a second after that one loads. So let's do a carbon price. Now we can look at the details of how high we want the carbon price to be. Give me a dollar value. What should the global carbon price be in this experiment? Shout some numbers out. $200. Any others? 201. 150. No, this is not an auction. Okay. All right. So let's try 150. That was a sort of ambitious right now. Just for reference point, the current European Union emissions trading system is trading north of $100. So this would be, but we are seeing prices at about 150 level in Sweden and Switzerland and a couple of other jurisdictions. So let's say that the rest of the world caught up to them. What would that help us achieve? Let's go. Okay, 0.4 of a degree on top of all the other stuff that we were doing, okay? If we go to kind of the sort of fresh version of the model, which we'll do, I'll run this experiment. I think that there's some internet connectivity lags here. We'll see what that looks like by itself, but that's an incredibly important piece of the puzzle, right? And let's just to rewind that, notice that the carbon price has 2 different effects. One is that it's reducing the overall height of the mountain. We're making energy a little bit more expensive, and as a result, we're using less of it. We're getting more efficient, right? So if we look at a graph, for example, of energy efficiency in buildings, we're seeing an improvement in that energy efficiency. If we look at electrification, we're going to see an improvement in that electrification because of that carbon price. And then we're also seeing a shift in the mix of electricity. So we're hitting the high carbon sources the most, we're expanding our nuclear and renewables, and those 2 things together have a really important effect. 14 of you wanted to try methane and other gases, right? So here what you can see on the right is that we've got greenhouse gas emissions from land use, energy CO2, and then the rest of these are non-CO2, so F gases, methane, and nitrous oxide. So if we do a substantial effort to reduce methane and other gases, let's see what that does. That's another 0.3 of a degree avoided future warming. Okay, so now we're getting quite a bit closer. And notice that if you want, when you play with the tool, you can break that out separately and look at agricultural versus energy emissions of those non-CO2 greenhouse gases if you want to run those kinds of experiments. We've got 13 people voting to work on deforestation, reduce deforestation. So here we've got the land use emissions. Now, there's also 12 of you who want to plant new trees, which is afforestation. Okay, they just came to a tie. Excellent. So afforestation versus deforestation, right? They sound like they're pretty similar. So let's start by planting trees. So if we take all of the land where we might possibly plant trees around the world, let's say that we are able to plant on 75% of that land, okay? So this is truly a trillion trees program. Let's see what that does. Okay, that's 1/10 of a degree. A trillion trees is 1/10 of a degree. Now, I want to whoop, okay, because we got our 1/10 of a degree, but just notice that if we look at the land, for example, we just planted an India and a third worth of tree plantations, okay, and we got, for that, we got about 4 gigatons a year of carbon sequestered. At the same time that we're, even with the improvements that we made on the methane, we're still emitting 5.7 gigatons of CO2 equivalent in methane. So afforestation is really important. There's a lot of, I love trees. I grew up in Colorado. I literally hug trees because they smell like butterscotch, if you know what I'm talking about. But they don't allow us to put away quite enough carbon. But what if we stop cutting down the trees that we have, right? That's all this land use emission, particularly here in the 2020 to 2060 period. Let's see what happens if we reduce those deforestation emissions. Okay, that gives us another 1/10 of a degree, and it gets us below the 2-degree target that we set in Paris, okay? So I've still got 2 minutes left. We're already below 2 degrees. What's it going to take to get us across the finish line? So we've got, let's see, 10 votes for, 10 votes for technological carbon removal, all right? 7 of you wanted to invent nuclear fusion. Now, so that's kind of a fun thing, so let's give that a try. So if we invent nuclear fusion, which is this new zero carbon energy, let's see what does that do? What does that allow for us? Boom, so we just added nuclear fusion to the mix. What did that do to future temperature? Absolutely nothing. Why? Why? Well, it's the same issue that we had when we subsidized nuclear, which is that it's substituting away from renewables and nuclear. We're trading off between green energy sources. Plus, nuclear fusion takes a long time to ramp up the entire supply chain, training all the workforce, getting through the NIMBY issues, building it up. So it's important for getting us to Mars. It's going to be important in the very long-run energy mix, but it's not going to solve global climate change. In fact, that was one of the original reasons we developed En-ROADS, was to convince Bill Gates of exactly that fact. The last thing that people have voted for is technological carbon removal. There's a lot of interest on that. If you want, you can play with all the details here: direct air capture, mineralization, soil carbon, biochar. If we just do a portfolio of those innovations, let's see what we get. Okay, so that, if I put like 30% of our total potential here, that gets us another 1/10 of a degree. If we crank it a little higher, we might be able to put a little bit more away. But notice, just as I was suggesting before, the land use requirements, right? So we're talking about that green line is just using land to spread rocks on the ground, okay? We're going to use an India worth of spreading rocks on the ground? I don't think so. So we might have to back that off a little bit. But what you see here is a scenario for 1.8 degrees. Now, those of you who are involved in climate transition risk planning and temperature alignment for financial institutions, one of the important messages here is that there is not just the 1.5 degree scenario or the 2 degree scenario. In fact, there's a whole variety of different pathways that can get us to 2 degrees or below. Some of them have a greater role for natural gas and others don't. So a more detailed, thoughtful scenario development is possible through En-ROADS, and then you can use this and complement it with other tools like the ones that you see here in the exhibition that are more granular and more data-driven. But the important thing is that this tool helps us to imagine a future that otherwise might seem unimaginable. And that is actually the most important point, is we can upgrade our quality of our conversations about this topic when we can be grounded in the data and science, and we can upgrade the quality of our inspiration and our motivation when we actually can see a future that's viable for our kids and grandkids, as Michelle Wu asked us to do. Thank you for your time.
Please welcome to the stage Senior Vice President, Sustainability, Dylan Siegler.
As the voice of God just informed you, I'm Dylan Siegler, and I head up corporate sustainability at GreenBiz. And so first of all, thanks to Jason J. That was incredible. I am honored to have with me two folks to talk about an issue that I think is front of mind for many of us. Stephen Rothstein, let's see if I can get this right, Managing Director of the Series Accelerator for Capital Market Sustainability?
Great.
Something like that? And Mike Pichek, who is the Treasurer of the State of Vermont. Round of applause for these folks. What is front of mind for many of us in the room here is that we are seeing in the world a campaign against ESG that has come from some on the right. And it's resulted in, at this point, something like 15 states enacting anti-ESG laws. We've got another dozen that are looking at passing such legislation. And that's both a cause and an effect of a larger headwind that we're seeing. Everyone on this stage seems to be using the term headwind today around ESG and what it means to the investing world. So to round out today's keynotes, we want to talk about this, and we want to especially get into how those who believe in the value and the power of ESG, and more specifically, of ensuring that the risks and the opportunities that are involved in making investment decisions can be actually taken into account. How can those of us who care about those things push proactively in the other direction? Stephen, I'd like to start with you. Briefly, tell us about the Freedom to Invest initiative that Ceres launched back in March, and what was the motivation for bringing it to be?
Sure. Yeah, thank you, and thanks to all of you and Joel and everybody. So probably everyone in this room has been working for years and some for decades on the idea that climate is a risk and an opportunity that fiduciaries need to think about and make enormous progress. There are tens of trillions of dollars of assets that are now invested in that way. There are large companies that are moving. So there's clearly a movement. In the last 12 to 18 months, there has been, from my perspective, an irrational backlash. As you say, there are 37 states that have introduced legislation. Several have passed, but it's interesting, even in the red states, for every bill that's passed, 3 have failed. So it's important to keep that in mind. There are a set of hearings in Congress, including, for those of you who may not know yet, Congress has called 7 more hearings, let me say that again, 7 more hearings in the month of July on ESG, and there's litigation, a variety of things. So, and we started to have meetings, and we didn't want to be the anti-ESG people. That doesn't make sense, and the first rule is if you're explaining, you're losing. So, but what is the core element of what we're talking about? It's the freedom. It's the freedom to think about risk, whether those are water risk or biodiversity risk or flood risk or others, and of the opportunities, the IRA and the others. So we did some market testing as well, which I'm happy to share, and to have a broad base, and we started, encourage you to take a look, go to freedomtoinvest.org, and we'd love to have everyone join with us.
Great. And so hearing that, Mike, why was it important for Vermont to get involved in this? And a second question, if I may.
Yeah.
What are you looking to get out of it?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. Thanks, Dylan. Thanks, everybody, for inviting us today. So why we got involved, before I was the treasurer for the state of Vermont, I was the insurance commissioner. And when you think about insurance, it's all about risk diversification, risk management. And just like Stephen said, if you can't think about those risks freely and work with them and mitigate them and avoid them, then it's really a fundamental thing for financial services, for investing, for insurance. Imagine going back centuries ago and telling Benjamin Franklin that you couldn't consider how close houses were, whether they're wooden or stone, or how far away they were from a fire department. They're just really basic, fundamental things that have been with us for generations and centuries, and we've incorporated them as financial professionals, as citizens, and it's really important to be able to continue to do that going forward when we're managing things like teacher pensions and state employee pensions and firefighter pensions. These are things that are just really too important not to consider those kind of fundamental risks. So what we're hoping to get out of it is really an education for the broader financial professional community, for my colleagues across the country, for average citizens, that these are really important things. They matter to really important people in our society, and we need to be focused on them.
I'll put the same question to you, Steve. What does success look like from Siri's point of view?
Simply to have a rational conversation. We fundamentally believe that if people think about the risks and opportunities, for example, just to take the insurance example, there's a bill working its way through the Texas legislature now, I think it's gone to the governor's desk, that says, let me say this now with a straight face, that if you're an insurance company and if you think about climate, you can't do business with the state of Texas. I mean, fundamentally, that is the insurance industry's work, to think about risk and opportunities. So we want to have a rational conversation. I'm an incurable optimist. I think if you do that, we'll get to the place, you know, in 2022, 60% of our country had election denialism on the ballot. Today, most people, except for one candidate of one party, think that that was not factually true or a winning political issue. My hope is in 2025 that the country understands that this was a diversion, and we go back to moving the way we continue to move. Even this year, more money has moved to ESG than ever before, and it's because of, again, the risks, the fires, the floods, and the opportunities that we see all the time, including the IRA.
I understand that Siri's did some polling around this before you launched the initiative. Can you talk a little bit about what you learned?
Sure. So the extensive polling done and oversampling in more red states, and what we over 1,500 people. And the question is, do you believe you should have the freedom to think about, if you're a company, risks and opportunities? And even the folks of both parties, more extremes on either, over 90% say yes. 90% say yes. Then a separate question is, do you believe that companies can make a profit and do well by their shareholders, but also meet societal's needs in terms of climate issues? Again, in that case, it was over 85% say yes. Third question is, do you want state legislators to telling you what you can and cannot invest in? 3/4 said no. Those are just some examples of that. I'm happy to share more later. So this is based, and again, the freedom to invest is intentionally, if you go to the website, you won't see a lot of green, you'll see a lot of red, white, and blue, because we do think this is patriotic, and we're not going to give that away to the other side for 1 second.
Mike, your peers in finance broadly are in the room, and likely some folks who are in state finance, and further, probably some people who deal in state pensions. And I'm curious what your call to action would be to those peers. Is it simply to sign your name up on the website for Freedom to Invest, or what more can the finance business do?
Yeah, again, a great question, because I think it's so important for the individuals that are controlling funds, that are controlling those important investment decisions, to make sure that politics does not creep into those investment decisions. It's too important of a decision to let the sort of issue of the day come in and make short-term decisions that are going to have long-term impacts, when in a year from now, the parties are probably going to move on to some other issue, or the party in particular that we're talking about is going to move on to some other issue of the day. So this is something that we're experiencing in the short term, but we need to be thinking about, obviously, long-term investing and what those strategies are long-term and all of the risks that we've talked about. So what can you do? I mean, certainly standing up and taking action where you see fit. But I really think the most important thing you can do is to think about the stakeholders that you serve, the stakeholders that make decisions in your organizations or in your communities, and make sure you're having those rational conversations with them about the importance of considering environmental, social, and governance factors, among other things, when making business decisions, when making investment decisions. So that education and educating your key stakeholders is critical.
Mike, another for you. Freedom to Invest is an advocacy move. It's not actually trying to move the needle on legislation. But I'm curious whether there is a move that you see coming in Vermont. How is Vermont approaching this issue from a legislative standpoint?
So I think we talked about the states that have anti-ESG legislation. 37 states, I think, have introduced some form of anti-ESG legislation. Vermont is not one of them. I can't say the same for New Hampshire, or Maine. So if you're making your summer plans still for vacation, Vermont would be more than happy to welcome you. And I don't see anything anti-ESG coming down the pike by any means. We're thinking of risk almost on the entirely different end of the spectrum about fossil fuel and the risk that it poses to our pension systems. We're not talking about divesting immediately. We're not talking even about divesting completely in the long term, but we're talking about understanding the risk that we have of exposure to the fossil fuel industry and making sure that we're mitigating that risk over time, doing advocacy and engagement over time where appropriate. So those are the things that we're focused on, fortunately. I think they're much more, rational conversations to be having about the long-term success of our pension funds.
Steve, does Ceres have a dog in that race in terms of actually trying to get legislation passed? What are you watching as you look across the state legislative landscape?
So first is just on what Mike was saying, we think that everyone, whether every company and every investor, should have a transition plan on a variety of topics, but on climate, and not just a 2050, because the reality is the average CEO is there 6.7 months, 6 years, 7 months, so that's going to be several CEOs in the future. But where's the company or the investment firm want to be in 2025, in 2030, in 2035? And to decarbonize your portfolio over time, and to look at those risks, and to take advantage of those opportunities. If you're selling spark plugs, will those be around in 10 years with the EVs, or what are the new technologies? So looking at those risks and opportunities. And we're very active at the state and federal level. We're a 501c3, not a C4, so not lobbying directly, but within what's allowed. And we're very involved with educating legislators. I mean, I'll tell you a story. There was a state that was introducing one of these anti-ESG bills. We went to educate legislators. We got a trade association and others. The day before the hearing, they canceled it because once they knew more, they decided not to go forward. Now, that's not going to happen in every state. But then there are other conservative states. One of the things that's important to know is that these are costing these states an enormous amount of money. I'll give you an example. Wharton did a study, and one of our colleagues from Wharton is here, that looked at Texas. And there were 6 banks that were allowed to bid for municipal bond work. The mayor was here earlier, and municipal bond work. 5 of them had ESG policies, so they were banned temporarily. The one that was left had higher rates. So the state of Texas taxpayers are going to spend up to $523 million more just in interest cost. So we want to so we're educating legislators at the federal and state level, also supporting things like Department of Labor, just was talking earlier about retirement funds, and trying to ensure that there is these choices in the future.
We heard from another speaker on this stage earlier that all of us who perhaps live in liberal bubbles or even independent bubbles should befriend a Republican. I'd love to get your take on that, each of you.
Well, my dad is a Republican and my mom's a Democrat. I'm a Democrat, so I used to listen more to my dad when I was a young kid. I don't know, it was more impactful on me, but I sided with my mom long term. But in all seriousness, I worked prior to being treasurer for those 6 years under a Republican governor. So, in Vermont, we have this bipartisanship. I mean, we have sort of the extremes as well. But it's so important, I think, to break through that political wall. I mean, it's almost like our religion now, politics, that when my parents got married, one was Irish, one was Polish. They'd never married out of their ethnic group, but their parents said, well, at least they're both Catholic. And I think now you wouldn't really care what the religion is of your children as long as they're both Democrats or as long as they're both Republicans. So I think that's very true, and we need to break through that. And the only way you can do it is through relationships, through conversation. I was with a speaker earlier this week that said, make sure you know who your neighbors are. If you don't know who their names are today, make sure when you go home, you introduce yourself to them and start to build a relationship among your community.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I agree with what Bob Eccles said. And I would encourage all of us, let me give you just a very brief thought exercise. Imagine you're all at GreenFin in 2025, okay? It can either be that all of us decide in the audience, listen, this is an issue that's nice, but I have a lot of other work to do to sell my product or service. I don't want to stick my head up. I don't want to get what Disney has happened to me. I'm going to let somebody else fight this. That's one example. The other one is that we all decide to get involved. The future of this industry is up to literally the people in this room, because you're probably the most outspoken folks. So I hope all of us reach out to people, Democrats, Republicans, all kinds of folks, that if everyone here writes a letter to the editor or does social media or an op-ed or signs a petition, whatever you want to do, that I think what GreenFin in 25 will be like will be determined by what each of us do in the coming months.
And we'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, that is today's keynote program. Next up, we have an hour of commiserating, breaking bread, networking. Then we've got another hour of great breakouts for you, and then networking receptions with some live music from some folks from Berkeley, the School of Music, not the one that educated me on the West Coast. Enjoy, and thank you so much for participating in the first day. See you tomorrow. All right.
Well, welcome back to Sidebar. That program was phenomenal, and I'm very impressed with your speed of getting from the main stage back to Sidebar.
I can apparently be in more than one place at once.
So I really enjoyed this program, and one theme that I noticed is just the way that we're like rethinking how we're working together and how we're talking with one another. It's like the elephant in the room here is how politicized ESG has become, how it's become, you know, as though engaging in these activities are somehow fall into some political category. Did you notice that? What did you see?
It was definitely a uniting theme of everyone that I heard on the main stage. I loved the Strine, Eccles, kind of Statler and Waldorf on this, and I think really they just brought it to the fore that, as I just brought up in my interview with Mike and Steve, we need to actually not just be reaching across the aisle, we need to actually be going across the aisle and stop just hanging out in our own little vacuums. So loving that, and I think we also heard that from Erica Karp today. Erica Karp, one of my favorite speakers, usually a bit of a potty mouth. She kept it under control today, which I was sort of disappointed about because I really like when she drops a nice, like, you know, curse word into her talk. But I think she was doing a bit of a poetic version of the same thing, saying we really need to actually be talking to each other, and we can't actually do this without collaboration.
Absolutely. I really love that call to everyone to start making friends with Republicans. I realize that on the live stream you couldn't see the number of hands in the audience, but overwhelmingly Democrat here. And I liked the comparison to if you look at the other markets that are just responsible for fiduciary activities like insurance actuaries. This is not a controversial issue. We're seeing, I live in California where insurance companies are pulling insurance right now because of climate risks. Yet there's somehow this disconnect when it steps into the political world that is like dividing us, when really this is like, I can't think of something that requires us to come together more.
Right. Yeah, this should all be fairly objective and rational. I liked what Steve Rothstein from Ceres said in our main stage talk, that it's possible to be both an incurable optimist and a really rational person in this market. Let's make sure that we actually can consider all of the risks and opportunities, and that we're not putting artificial firewalls in our investing decisions or really in any of the decisions we're making.
Yeah, and I also loved the climate modeling from Jay Jason, and we are going to be talking with him in just a little bit too. So we'll get to that right after a few ads.
As more businesses and communities prioritize sustainability, finding support can be a challenge. The Wells Fargo Institute for Sustainable Finance is here with insight and guidance. With a commitment of $500 billion in sustainable financing by 2030 and approximately $68 billion deployed in 2021, the Institute is helping make meaningful changes toward an equitable, low-carbon economy. Learn more at wellsfargo.com/sustainability.
If you are thinking about establishing a sustainability agenda, the first stage is to set up your carbon accounting practice. This is why we started with Persephone as step one.
I am very comfortable with this.
And we're back. We've got a really exciting guest, my old friend Emilio Tenuta, who is the Senior Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer at Ecolab. And we are just delighted to be able to talk with you today, particularly about water. Yeah. Tell us a little bit before we get started about your role and what you do at Ecolab.
Sure. So I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer at Ecolab, and I have, over the last 11 years, really worked on integrating our business strategy along with our sustainability strategy, all really intertwined. And we have operations around the world, so not only am I responsible for helping the company achieve their goals, but also working alongside our customers around water, climate, food, and health, mainly to help them achieve their water, nature, and climate goals.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that connection between water stewardship and effective climate action?
Absolutely. So one of the things that sometimes is forgotten is that water and climate and nature are linked. And we see this with water being a really focal point because in many ways, when you think of water stewardship, you're really focused on physical risk, regulatory risk, and reputational risk. And in many ways, the way we'll see the effects of climate change is through water, and namely the degradation of nature through wetland destruction and other factors like deforestation and other things are very much linked to water. And so if you don't have an effective water stewardship strategy, it's very difficult to have a really robust nature plan.
That's a great segue, because I know that Ecolab is working on TNFD. Now, Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. We're just going to try and define all of our alphabet soup today. This is a framework that's designed to help companies and financial institutions make nature-related decisions. And so the release of after much stakeholder engagement, the release of TNFD's version 1 is coming in September. Can you tell me a little bit about, in your view, how business leaders need to be engaging with this and what they need to know ahead of that release from your perspective?
Absolutely, Dylan. So it's early days. Let me just say we spent this morning talking about how TNFD is really something that we need to accelerate in a big way, even though the final framework isn't ready until September. And I guess where we are with it is, even coming out of the World Economic Forum in Davos, where biodiversity was absolutely the theme, we saw that executives really didn't have their heads around it, let alone having targets. So TNFD gives us a framework. They have a kind of a framework within a framework called LEAP, which stands for locate, evaluate, assess, and then prepare. And of course, the prepare part is the disclosure, the reporting, and the action that we take around nature. And we have been participating in the last few months in a pilot with Sustainable One from Global S&P. And in this pilot, we've achieved 2 of the 4 phases. And so under locate, we really are focused on what are the hotspots around Ecolab operations around the world, and what is the impact assessment that we see that refers to the impact that Ecolab has, out into nature. And then the dependencies, which is the second part of it, which is what is nature delivering to Ecolab and what are we dependent on, like water. Water is a critical part of our strategy as well in terms of the products that we have to make. And so it's a dependency that we have to focus on. So developing a robust water stewardship strategy is key to really beginning to prepare a strategy to actually report, disclose, and take action on nature.
Love it. Has there been anything that's surprised you about your work in this sphere?
I don't know if it's so much surprising, although we are being alerted to things like future regulatory risks. Now, for example, key biodiversity areas that have been identified by a number of international organizations that are vital to the planet's health. One of the things that we've discovered is there are some sites that we have to consider being near biodiversity, key biodiversity areas. So we refer to that as transitional risk, which means that we need to now start thinking about they could be regulated in the future. And so those kind of learnings, as well as how we think about the work that we do around our own operational sites where they're at risk because of water scarcity or too much water, or in some cases poor quality water.
It's really exciting work. Thank you so much for joining us. Emilio Tenuta, CSO at Ecolab.
How do we protect what is vital to life in an ever-changing world? At Ecolab, we partner to make the world cleaner, safer, and healthier, helping customers succeed while protecting people and the resources vital to life. Together with our customers, we help prevent the spread of pathogens and safeguard the sustainability of our future. To create communities where people are healthy, our planet is respected, and businesses can thrive. For the past 100 years, and for generations to come. At Ecolab, we are protecting what's vital.
The future belongs to the bold. Bold leaders, making business more sustainable and resilient now to create long-term value and deliver a competitive edge. Now is the time for bold solutions. Take action with KPMG.
By the first two.
Welcome back. We are joined now with Lynn Shank, who is the Director of Business and Environmental Initiative at Harvard Business School. Lynn, thanks for joining us at Sidebar.
Thank you so much for having me.
So as we just heard, it is imperative for so many sectors to be working together in order to really address the climate crisis. So what do you think is needed to unlock more capital in order to really be catalyzing this?
I think, as you just said, it's all about collaboration. It's all about thinking, when you're looking at a project, looking at a company, who are all of the stakeholders that are involved in getting something done? I mean, it is never just a one-off finance story where you look at it and you just assume that the revenues happen or whatever it may be. There are so many parties that need to be involved and that need to really understand who each other are in order to, unlock scaled capital. I mean, I think about one example, if you don't mind. Sure. I think about one of the Harvard Business School cases written by Deborah Spar on Northvolt, and a large battery manufacturer looking to build a $4 billion facility in northern Sweden. And, that was a massive investment, and, people kind of coming out of nowhere, having not built that type of facility before, getting the car companies to pay for the offtake, to actually pay for what they would produce in advance in order to give that money in advance to get that facility built. And they wound up getting close to, $50 billion in financing offers. So it was a way of looking down the chain of who was going to want that to happen, who was going to want the product, and coming in and helping facilitate something that actually unlocked an enormous amount of capital to get it done. So the ways that different parties that have an interest in things getting done can actually get involved at earlier stages than expected, super important.
It's a fascinating example. I'm curious, over the past year we've seen the IRA start to be deployed, and we've heard about new options for non-dilutive funding for climate-related solution providers, startups, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in this space around capital and getting it? What are the keys that you're seeing to this kingdom?
Yeah, I mean, there are several, but a lot of it is, again, if you can demonstrate as a project developer, as a company early on, that you understand how stakeholder groups all the way down the value chain, down the line, several years down the road, are going to have use for what you are trying to create, and show how you've engaged them in the process. I think that's super important. That's really critical. I mean, you talk about the IRA, something that's really fascinating to me that was in the news just a couple of days ago is the expanded loan authority that the DOE, the Department of Energy, actually has through their loan program office, and that they have $40 billion of new loan authority, and they've just granted, and I don't know all of the details, but a $9 billion loan to Ford Motor Company to build multiple battery manufacturing facilities throughout the U.S. So compared to the Northwold example I just gave, where they were looking at the car companies to actually, come in early and actually provide some of the financing, here we have a car company like Ford who's able to vertically integrate this financing process because of this massive new loan authority that was given to the DOE through their loan programs office to be able to grant its largest loan ever to these car companies to create these facilities, and to create them in areas that are really being impacted by the energy transition. So in places in the South, and not the usual suspect type places, but actually building out the workforce and the manufacturing capacity in places that really need it in the U.S. So I think it's about really thinking about all these pieces of the thread, the workforce, the location, and the way that these government programs are unlocking that capacity to really access decently priced, scaled financing to be able to just do something big now and far faster than it's been done in the past.
I love that example too. The Loan Program Office is doing such innovative stuff right now, and we only have about 30 seconds left. But is there another example that you can give us of a success story about how finance has been deployed for these big green infrastructure projects?
Honestly, one of the success stories that I see is a company like Generate Capital. I was just speaking to their CEO, Scott Jacobs, a few seconds ago, and the success isn't always in the billion-dollar deal all at once. It's also people and companies that have figured out how to look at a series of small projects that are scalable, that are proven technology that you can do in $10, $20 million increments, but that actually can have this ripple effect and get done the same way over and over and over across the country, across the globe, and be deployable in multiple scenarios. And so I think the success is not just seen through scale, but it's seen through replicability and scalability. So it's not just that one whiz-bang $5 billion deal, but you can really see success in things that can be replicated that are very small scale to start. Actually, the first panel that I attended today on the green banks had a lot of those really good examples as well.
Great thing to keep in mind. Lynn Shank, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you both
today on Sidebar.
So fun, and thanks for having me.
We challenge the investment status quo by challenging each other. Welcome to the power of independent thinking at scale.
Welcome to Wellington.
Wellington Management. Invest in unique perspectives.
MSCI is there at every step on your climate journey to help you define objectives, measure progress, monitor, and report your alignment.
We are back with Meg Parker-Young, who's Vice President of ESG Strategy at Fannie Mae. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Meg, will you tell us a little bit about what you do at Fannie Mae?
Sure thing. So, as Vice President of ESG Strategy, I help our organization think about the issues that that really intersect inside of home and housing finance within the United States. So, at Fannie Mae, that means everything from climate risk and resilience all the way to racial equity and stability, and the ways in which those intersect in the way that we work in the marketplace and the outcomes we're trying to drive.
What are you prioritizing among those really important ESG issues in housing finance right now?
So, the role that we play in the marketplace is really specific. We are operating at a huge scale, and we're doing so under a charter from the U.S. government to be in all markets at all times. We need to make sure that as we do this, we're providing liquidity, affordability, and stability. And so that means that we have a lot of priorities to balance at once. I would say in this present moment, the spaces that we're watching most closely are those spaces of climate risk. So thinking about, as we look at the homes that underlie those mortgages, the flood and fire risk for those over time, thinking about climate resilience for communities, and the intersecting social issues of the history of racial inequity, frankly, in finance and in housing finance, and the ways in which we have opportunities to think more productively about opportunities to create a more equitable finance system on the whole.
I want to drill down a little bit more on that topic you just mentioned of scale. So Fannie Mae, it's one of the 4 major mortgage providers in the U.S. You have such a huge portfolio. How do you ensure that the work that you're doing is matching the scale or like the power that you have?
Absolutely. And I'm going to do a little bit of basics around it, which is that we do not provide mortgages, but we are behind 1 in 4 mortgages. And so part of that means that we're supporting all of those banks that are putting those mortgages out there. And behind the scenes, being behind 1 in 4, it means that when we're making a decision about where we want to focus our energy, there's huge ramifications for that. And so one of the things that we did the last couple of years that really brought that home was by creating a consumer housing journey that helped us think about these issues across the lifespan from a consumer's perspective. So again, we're operating this massive scale, but thinking really as an individual from before the time that you are looking at a house or thinking about renting or buying to being within a house and then looking to maintain that over time. What are the obstacles you might face along the way? And specifically, how do we unpack those to make sure that we understand the role we might play in removing them over time? And are they different, for instance, by geography, by race or ethnicity? And so that approach has allowed us to think broadly about problems, but then to find individual ones that we can really impact at scale. And so I think a lot of the work in our equitable housing finance plan and our racial equity work in particular has helped us to demonstrate that.
It's really exciting work, and I would say that the average person on the street does not know that Fannie Mae is doing this. To that end, I understand that you've released in the last year your first sustainability report or ESG report. Tell me how you refer to it. What was that like? What prompted it? And what did you learn?
Absolutely. So I love that at Fannie Mae, this is building on a big legacy of transparency, frankly. For better or for worse, through the years, we have been publishing a whole lot of data as it relates to housing and equitable access to housing, green bond impacts. Fannie Mae is one of the biggest issuers of green bonds in the world. So we've had green bond impact reports. And I came into my role about 3 years ago, and what I saw was just a huge wide variety of amazing information. This allowed us to create a really consolidated space that's meeting the market in a way that it needs to be met in terms of providing that simple, direct access to the information that investors, raters, other stakeholders really need to find in one spot so that they can have an informed understanding of all the work that's dynamically been going on for years at Fannie Mae and be able to leverage that in their understanding and partnership moving forward.
So what topics are you watching closely for the next couple of years?
I think the thing that I'm watching the most closely is our capacity to work across topics. And so I think especially, at the start, we talked about climate, we talked about race, we're talking about housing stability. Once you get in a home, can you stay there? I would say that the intersection of those 3, to me, is one of the most important spaces for housing moving forward. And our capacity to be able to have experts in all of these who have the ability to really collaborate together, work together to find those systemic understandings and solutions that also provide market value. Because at the end of the day, this is about producing, you know, the most efficient market we can that can support as many people as want to be able to be inside of homes, whether they're renting or owning. So that intersection point is what I'm most excited about.
Once again, we are here with Meg Parker-Young, who is the Vice President of ESG Strategy at Fannie Mae. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
As more businesses and communities prioritize sustainability, finding support can be a challenge. The Wells Fargo Institute for Sustainable Finance is here with insight and guidance. With a commitment of $500 billion in sustainable financing by 2030 and approximately $68 billion deployed in 2021, the Institute is helping make meaningful changes toward an equitable, low-carbon economy. Learn more at wellsfargo.com/sustainability.
If you are thinking about establishing a sustainability agenda, the first stage is to set up your carbon accounting practice. This is why we started with Persephone as step 1.
The financial industry's largest emissions impact comes from financed emissions, a category that is notoriously difficult to measure. Rely on the only solution designed for complex corporations and financial service companies like Blackstone seeking to measure and manage the carbon footprint of their portfolios.
However you want to spend the time. I'm here.
We are back at Sidebar with Jason Jay, who is the Director of Sustainability Initiative at MIT Sloan School of Management. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Can you start by telling us a little bit about what that means? What do you do at MIT?
Oh, sure. Well, I teach business students, which is super fun. I teach executives. And I support research projects that are aiming to improve the quality of our conversation about sustainability and provide, you know, some greater rigor and discipline to the field as it grows.
MIT gets quoted a lot in the conversation broadly about aggregate confusion, which is not only the name of my new punk band, but is actually a term of art that talks about a real phenomenon in ESG measurement. Can you talk a bit about aggregate confusion in a way that is not confusing? And so, what is it? What are you know? What are some of the learnings from your research?
First of all, Roberto Rigobon, who's the professor who got this thing started, would love your opening joke because he is actually a rock musician. So it started off with this observation that asset managers were trying to use ESG data, and they would go get data from different sources and providers, and they would completely disagree with each other. And we didn't really understand why. And the paper that came out of our group, which is called Aggregate Confusion, the Divergence of ESG Ratings, was the first one to sort of really point out this problem and then understand the underlying causes for why, you know, MSCI and Sustainalytics and, you know, Vigeo or now Moody's would come to such massively different conclusions. You could have some companies that were top quartile in one rating and bottom half of the other one. And we've tried to illuminate what the problems are, why that happens, and then point a path toward you know, a more effective use of ESG information and effective production, analysis, and use of ESG information.
Got it. Sort of.
No, I mean, look, it's complicated, right? So here's the issue is that, you know, companies, the rating agencies sit in the middle of this value chain, right? BlackRock and others use MSCI, for example, to tilt their ESG portfolios, but you know, essentially that is an opinion. The MSCI rating is an opinion about the firms, and that opinion is based on a set of data, and different rating agencies are using different different scopes. Like some include electromagnetic field pollution and some don't. Some include lobbying and some don't. And then when they do agree, so we all care about women's empowerment, for example, we measure it really differently. So one might look at sexual harassment lawsuits, and one might look at number of women on the board, another might look at number of women in middle management. And they're all sort of different ways of measuring the same underlying concept. So the first observation was the divergence relates to those two things. We define it differently, we measure it differently. Now the question is, where do we go from here? And there's a whole series of research papers and things that have come out about how asset managers can use multiple data sources and kind of triangulate between them to get a better answer than they could from only one. We're doing a set of engagement with policymakers about how these ESG rating agencies should be regulated so that they can be more transparent, so that we can, there might be an appeals process for companies, and how the whole system could be improved if we could have better disclosure, more consistent disclosure on the part of companies. So that we can really get to a place where we can achieve the goals of this whole community, which is to have better information about firms, make better decisions, and have a better impact on the world.
Yeah, you just noted how asset managers are triangulating, and a lot of the people that are at this conference are in that asset manager,
Yes.
the financial world, or financing world. What do you recommend, or what can they do to get involved to improve the quality of this data? Because it sort of seems like that's not sustainable for everybody to try to figure that out on their own.
No, that's right. I mean, there's a group of investors have joined with us to be part of this aggregate confusion project. There's a pension fund and 3 asset managers and an index provider who are really chipping in and thinking with us about the research. And we actually are open to a couple more members. So if people really want to roll up their sleeves with us, come talk. And then if you want to just learn from what's emerging from that community, you can go to, if you Google Aggregate Confusion Project, you'll find our website, and all the papers that we publish eventually end up there, even though our members get earlier access to the insights that come out of it.
It's been really exciting to talk to you and learn a little bit more about how we're going to untangle all of this aggregate confusion. We've been talking to Jason Jay. He's the director of the Sustainability Initiative at MIT Sloan. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
How do we protect what is vital to life in an ever-changing world? At Ecolab, we partner to make the world cleaner, safer, and healthier, helping customers succeed while protecting people and the resources vital to life. Together with our customers, we help prevent the spread of pathogens and safeguard the sustainability of our future. To create communities where people are healthy, our planet is respected, and businesses can thrive. For the past 100 years, and for generations to come, at Ecolab, we are protecting what's vital.
The future belongs to the bold. Bold leaders, making business more sustainable and resilient now to create long-term value and deliver a competitive edge. Now is the time for bold solutions. Take action with KPMG.
We challenge the investment status quo by challenging each other. Welcome to the power of independent thinking at scale.
Welcome to Wellington.
Wellington Management. Invest in unique perspectives.
Thank you so much, all of you live streamers, for joining us today at Sidebar. I want to thank my co-host Sarah Golden for being with me today. I want everyone to join us again tomorrow at 10:25 Eastern. That's in the morning, not in the PM. More keynotes, more interviews. Sarah, what are you most looking forward to tomorrow?
Okay, so for the keynotes tomorrow, I'm really looking forward to the conversation between Senator Markey with Mindy Luber, who I mentioned earlier is the CEO of Series. And I'm also really looking forward to our Big Little Talks, which is our series where we have like 1 minute really short videos where people share a big idea in a little amount of time, and I always find them to be really inspiring and interesting and thought-provoking. Is there anything you're looking forward to tomorrow?
I've heard that the Big Little Talk that we'll get from the Rhode Island Congressman, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, will be exceptional. So I'm looking forward to that. And I really am looking to sort of see how all of this conversation about how we need to come together ends up bearing out over these other conversations, and whether we're going to come to some resolutions and some calls to action for what we can all actually do once we leave these hallowed halls at the Omni at the seaport.
It's so important. Like, how do we actually take these ideas and take it out into the world? That's what it's all about. So, yeah, thanks for that framing. Well, thank you, everyone. And once again, join us tomorrow, 10:25 a.m. Eastern Time.
We'll be here.